everyone to this session where the Global Tapestry of Alternatives is sharing on community resilience during COVID-19 through radical alternatives. It's a great pleasure for us at the Global Tapestry of Alternatives to be involved in this conference, and we see this largely as an opportunity that we're going to be learning and also sharing some of the work that we're doing as well. My name is Vasna Ramasar, and I bring greetings to you from Copenhagen, where I'm sitting at the moment, but originally from South Africa. So both are home to me. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully you'll be able to see the presentation. Just give me a moment. Great. Hopefully that you can see this presentation now up on the screen.
Yep, we're all set.
Good. As I said, I welcome you on behalf of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives to the session, which is both about sharing some of the work and the interesting experiences around community resilience that we've been involved in, but we also hope to use some of the time to also hear from you about your own community resilience practices during this strange period of the pandemic. The structure of the session is the short introduction that I will give now, but I will also talk a little bit about some of the stories that we've been collecting through the GTA and the work that's come out from various parts of the world. My friend and colleague from the GTA, but also from the African Biodiversity Network, Simon Mitambo, will hopefully be joining us. He's having some connection issues right now, but I hope that he will be able to share some of the work that is happening in East Africa that he has been involved in. And then we will have Ashish Katari, who is from Kalpravish, but also from the GTA, sharing a bit on the experiences from India, as well as hopefully giving some broader reflections as well. After that, we want to hopefully have about 20 minutes or so where we invite you to discuss, exchange, and of course also we'll take any questions that you might have. So the first part of what I'd like to do in the sharing is just introduce what the Global Tapestry of Alternatives is and what we're doing, and also use this as an opportunity of inviting you to participate with us to share the incredible knowledge that exists within the various groups as part of what we're doing. It is a tapestry because we are working towards a worldwide weaving of a system of transformation to the current system where we recognize the dominant system being capitalist, racist, patriarchal, and so many other very harmful forms that are no longer sustainable to people or to non-human nature. And so we're working towards and talking about the systemic and transformative alternatives that exist across the world. And it is both sort of arising from, but also complementing resistance that is happening everywhere. We've heard earlier today some of the sort of injustices that are taking place. And so there is about resisting, but also about creating within that space. And just to give you some of the examples that are out there, whether it is Ubuntu in Africa, which I will be talking about in a little while, or Sumak Kauswe in South America, or many other processes that we are all familiar with, and some that we are not as familiar with. Eco Swaraj coming from India, which Ashish will talk about a little bit. And so this is really about moving towards a just, sustainable, and equitable society. And through that, it is about radical alternatives that focus on ecological resilience and wisdom, culture and knowledge diversity, radical democracy, economic democracy, and underlying that social justice and well-being as being these interconnected, integrated spheres that are essential for us to actually transform towards a just, sustainable, and equitable society. And some of the things, the values and principles that we talk about in terms of transformative alternatives are numerous. First, about diversity and pluralism. Many of the examples and cases that we're going to talk about today are from other parts of the world than where many of you are from. And that's partly where it's a privilege for us to learn, but it's also a privilege to share. So it is about recognizing the diversity and pluralism that exists around the world and rejoicing in that, finding those common areas where we come together, but also finding those differences and seeing what they bring that's specific and unique to a particular place. Self-reliance for basic needs, self-governance and autonomy, cooperation, collectivity, solidarity, and commons thinking, rights with responsibilities of meaningful participation, dignity and creative labor, qualitative pursuit of happiness, and really thinking through what that means when we talk about happiness. Obviously, equity, justice, inclusion, rights of nature, and then ideas of simplicity. And I think Ashish will talk to some of these as well in the context of the cases in India. So these are some of the elements that we've been drawing from and sharing through the different alternatives that are out there in the world. Non-violence, peace and harmony, subsidiarity and eco-regionalism as other elements as well, right? All of these worldviews that truly celebrate life rather than commodify life. So the global tapestry of alternatives, it is about bringing together the confluences of resistance and alternatives. We're working towards weaving that tapestry through sharing, exchanges, and collaborations. And so participation in your important conference is part of doing so. It's also about the collective visioning of a just world. So thinking about what that world is that we are creating and how we get there through building our tapestry together. Just very quickly, some of the objectives that we are focused on is creating the space for collaboration, learning, and exchange, offering active solidarity whenever it's needed, giving visibility to alternatives, and here is what we are focusing on a little bit today. Hopefully inspiring and supporting other people to create their own initiatives, and quite importantly, creating that critical mass for macro change, for the transformation that we seek. The process of doing that is through finding these opportunities where we engage with each other. The pandemic has in some ways closed down the spaces for us to physically meet and touch and talk eye to eye, but it has also opened up these unique opportunities through online participation where we are engaging each other. And so trying to find that, but also doing so with a recognition of the need for cross-cultural, cross-language, cross-sectoral exchanges, doing so and understanding and respecting the different ways of being, doing, understanding, and existing in the world. The Global Tapestry is not an organization. We're a process and we're a space that is currently being held by a core group, but it is based on the idea that there is a decentralized weaving of movements, social movements in different groups around the world that are actually building the alternatives, individually and together. Right. And if you're interested in finding out more information about what we do, this is our website, www.globaltapestryofalternatives.org. So with that introduction to what the Global Tapestry is, I want to move now to the core of today's session, which is thinking about community resilience in the times of the pandemic. And one point that I just want to put there is that something Boaventura de Sousa Santos says, there is no global social justice without global cognitive justice. So we have focused in thinking about community resilience in also engaging with the different ways, not just that people do things, but the way people exist in the world as well. And so this is about trying to build that solidarity and also creating new norms and strengthening some of the old norms through it. It's about pluriversal thinking, and that pluriversal thinking for us is about both respecting and strengthening old ways of doing things, traditional ways of doing things, but also about opening spaces for new ways of thinking and doing things, like, for example, ideas of degrowth that are coming up in Europe that might have a resonance but a different form in other parts of the world. And ultimately for us, this is about creating the enabling environment and about thinking about change and how we do it together in a way that is really emancipatory and empowering to people. So drawing from that, we've been focusing on alternatives, and the Global Tapestry Alternatives had a series of webinars called the Dialogue on Alternatives in the Time of Global Crisis. That is part of our second series. We had a first series that ran through last year. The slide here just shows you some of the amazing talks that we have, and I see them almost as gifts that were given to us by people sharing what they were doing through very difficult times. And you're welcome to see those by actually going to the website as well. After those webinars, we also started to think about how do we capture these stories, which in these times of multiple crisis, for me at least, were spaces of hope, spaces of opportunity and learning. And so we started to work on community resilience stories, documenting the experiences and work of communities around the world, especially in terms of how they were strengthening resilience through alternatives. What we found through the many conversations, the many stories that were told, and documentations that we received is that there's a wide range of approaches that people are doing. And as I said, it involves both enriching traditional practices as well as new ways of being and doing things in the world. One thing that was quite important, and I think is something that we need to take forward as we think about working together and moving forward together, is this notion of community as something that has really been strengthened through the pandemic at local levels, but also in some ways in the global sense. We still fight global forces of capitalism, which are against that, but we have seen a strengthening of community during this time. Another lesson that came out of the different stories that we had was the importance of underlying processes of participatory and inclusive decision making and autonomy as also being critical. Through that as well was elements around how do we actually create processes that are decolonial and feminist in their very nature. And those were the ones where a lot of the success has come out. The heartening thing that we also found is that a lot of the community resilience stories that we engaged with, the foundations were already well established before the pandemic and actually continued to grow through the pandemic. So that resilience is something that is born out of the way communities were already choosing to operate, the way they were bringing in alternatives to the norms that exist in the world, and that it then simply flourished through this time. I'm going to take a little bit of time now to share just a couple of experiences from the stories that we have been collecting, which we're soon going to be publishing on our website. And then I will invite Simon and Ashish to also share from their own experiences. The first of these is one that I haven't personally been involved in, but for me was a deep learning experience to actually engage with the communities of the potato park, Parque de la Papa in Peru, and to actually find out how they've been operating in terms of trying to protect indigenous land, indigenous genes, and indigenous culture And also through the pandemic, how it enabled them to support themselves and other people. So this is one of the areas where it's the people of the Cusco Valley who have joined with a nonprofit group, the Quechua Aymara Association for Sustainable Communities, and they are working to protect biodiversity. And they do this in a way that is very much about living in a reciprocal relationship with the land, with each other, and the spirit world. When they gifted us by sharing the work that they were doing, it was done in a way that was actually appreciating and valuing all of these aspects. And this was core to sort of really living true and being true to their own culture. In the communities of the Potato Park, people strive for a balance between the Ailu of the Runas, the humans and their domesticated crops and animals, the Salaka, the wild plants and creatures, and the Auki Ailu, which is the sacred beings, including the mountain protector spirits. All of this is about working towards a well-being, which in Quechua societies is defined as Sumakauswe. Some of the things that they have done during the time before the pandemic and then continuing into the pandemic is setting up an indigenous biocultural heritage area, working with scientists to preserve the biocultural heritage of the area, and also to do that in a way where authority is shared amongst the different villages. One really heartening thing to find out during their work was that during the pandemic itself, they were able to produce food for themselves, but also for some of the urban centers around them, where because people were so tied to the economic system and were losing jobs or money, were not able to actually feed themselves anymore. So you can find out more about this case both on numerous websites, but also in the talk that they gave to the GTA in our webinar series. The second case that I want to share is around WoMin, African Women Alliance Weaving a Just World for People and Nature. This is one that I've been involved in South Africa, women rising against repression and extractivism. And also because it's really important here, the idea of who are the climate warriors. It's actually many women in the grassroots who are doing that work. In terms of resilience and alternative development, some of the work these communities are doing is really embracing a notion of Ubuntu, believing that we are human through other humans. I am because you are. And that means finding a different way of understanding our humanity through others, but also in our relationship with nature. And in doing so, they are also resisting the kind of developments that are for profit, but are actually now starting to focus on building community from within, preserving indigenous traditions and biodiversity whilst resisting resource extraction. There are also a number of alternatives in Europe, and I will mention just very briefly some of the practices around degrowth through Cargonomia in Budapest in Hungary, where a bike community has got together with local food producers in terms of food distribution, as well as commoning practices in Desgraça in Lisboa, in Portugal, where it was about also creating community kitchens within the time of the pandemic. All of these people coming together around trying to both resist, but to create those alternatives and ultimately create that safety net and support to allow people to flourish in a way that also has allowed nature to flourish. I don't want to take up too much more time in what I have to say, but just want to sort of leave this last note of saying that this is for us the start of a conversation with many of you. And so if you would like to be in contact, these are our contact details. But hopefully we can open up to some space for discussion before the end of the session. So I will now, and hopefully Simon has been able to join us, ask Simon Mitambo, who is, as I said, from the African Biodiversity Network and the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, to share a little bit about his experiences from Kenya. Simon, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Vasna, for a very good presentation. This is Simon Mitambo from Kenya. I am an EJ practitioner, the jurisprudence practitioner. I work to follow the law of nature. And just like Vasna has shared about our work in GTA, we work to develop alternatives because we are convinced that the current system is failing and we have to offer alternatives to the new order. So I just wanted to share a story. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. We tell a lot of stories in the community, so I want to share a story. And first of all, maybe also for people to know how I work. I actually work with African Biodiversity Network, which is a network of organizations here in Africa, working in 12 African countries, where mainly we are working with the indigenous people. But I have also taken an initiative of going back to my roots to follow the ways of my ancestors and my elders. And so this is the story I really want to share. It's a story of resilience, of how we started and how the whole issue of COVID came and how the response was. I have been traveling to many parts of Africa and also the world, and I've met many people. And one of the things that struck me is how communities are trying to revive their cultures. I went to Colombia, where I met the Amazonians, who were very passionate about revival of their traditions, and also went to South Africa in one of the indigenous communities there called Venda, who are also passionate. So I came back to my community and shared the story of how I saw this happening. And here I am talking about a story of transformation. So I didn't want to tell my people what I thought was good for them, but I just decided to share with them a story to see if they connect with the story and what they think about the story. So it was not about what I saw working for those people, what I saw doing very well according to my perspective, but I just wanted to share a story of what I saw and then ask my people what they think, whether they think that story is important. So I shared a story of those people who were under colonization and their ways of thinking and their ways of schooling and their ways of governance was interfered by colonialism. And they went to a point where they realized they had lost a lot because of that, embracing one part of the world thinking, the Western thinking, for example. I'm not saying that it is bad, but it is also not very fair when one thinking of one corner of the world becomes like it is the best for everyone. So I shared the story with them and what they were trying to do to remember what used to work for them. Some of them were, they brought the elders together, who are the custodians of their ancestral knowledge, and they started to walk a journey. And they started to revive their traditional food, which was very nutritious. And this was because they realized their children were suffering from malnutrition because they were eating one meal throughout the month, throughout the year, while they used to have diversity of crops and they did away with them. And a part of their food, like sugar, was being even imported from other places. And their children were being lost into embracing other cultures that they were not ancestral. So I shared this story, and to my surprise, two of the elders started crying. I didn't know why they cried. I just asked them, "Why are you crying?" They told me that they feel really cheated. They are actually in the same predicament that They have lost their culture. They have lost their food. They have lost their knowledge. They have lost their language. They have lost everything. And the elders had died, and they were like asking, why didn't you come yesterday? Because at least those elders who were there could help them. So I asked them what they think they can do. They said, we want to do exactly what those people are doing. Let us also meet and discuss how we can take, we can be in charge of our lives. So I asked them, how are we going to do this? So they agreed that to be able to do that, because it's also an homogeneous community where they have a clan governance, they said they don't want also to form groups like the self-help groups. They want to use their traditional structures so that they can invoke the power in those traditional structures. Because within the traditional structures, they know how they work when they meet. They know who is responsible for what, for the food they eat, for how they will travel. And we started a voluntary kind of a process where the elders came, the young people came, and the young people took care of the elders who could not walk. They could even carry them with their motorbikes. And it was a self-supporting system that started to evolve. So for the last 6 years, we have been meeting with the elders trying to remember what used to work, what is it that it has not been working well. And we went through a journey up to a point where we also drew our maps of trying to remember how things worked. So maybe because it's a very long story, I can just try to cut it short by saying that when coronavirus came, it found a community which had already started to remember about their traditional food, which is nutritious, about the knowledge of how they used to handle diseases, about the knowledge of how they can integrate themselves because of the challenge of fragmentation. I'm not sure if my video will work very well, Vasna, because I'm somewhere, I'm actually traveling. Yeah, sorry for that.
We can hear you well, Simon, so it's okay if you can't turn on the video.
Yeah, I saw the request to put on my video anyway. I'm sorry for that. So the coronavirus found a community that was already thinking very independently without looking for ideas from the scientists. And I want to say this because when coronavirus came, the scientists started to work to develop vaccine. They started to work to develop solutions. But what about the indigenous people? First of all, these people are people who don't actually even want that there will be diseases, there will be calamities, because we are not taking care of our environment. We are not keen about our biodiversity. And so for them, they said this disease is not a very unfamiliar disease. They are under similar situation, and they are under knowledge that they knew how to deal with the disease, especially around performance of some ratios and giving some certain supplement and isolations. They had all that kind of knowledge when Corona came. And what actually even stood out is the way they came together to perform rituals and to prevent the disease. And through this, by the way, even the Christians who are part of this community joined, and they said, after all, we are also indigenous people. We are also Africans. And the only separation is our religion sometimes. So they even participated when the elders asked for ingredient of performing these rituals. So one of the achievement of this is also to see our community came together in a situation where coronavirus was communicating with a lot of disinformation, and there was a lot of shock, and everyone was worried. But they came together in that kind of solidarity, the Ubuntu we are talking about. And you see, in that situation, they are able to face the challenge together, and whoever has a problem, it's their problem. It is not one person's problem. That today you have corona, today you have this problem, and you see it like your problem. It's the problem of everyone. And this helped a lot also for these people to be able to survive and to be able to move forward. And since then, they have started developing the urban gardens. We oriented the traditional arborists. And actually today we are meeting with the National Museums of Kenya who say that we can support the initiative of how these elders can develop this something like a medicine for all this, because they have this concession, they have this knowledge to take care of them. So I think let me cut that story short that way. But Sanjani, we have worked with the community, and the way by remembering, by following the steps of ancestors, by telling our stories, we have been empowered to take the responsibility of our lives and livelihoods into our own hands without depending from the external support that sometimes we die calling upon the government, calling upon the international community to support. We have diverse knowledge to deal with many challenges that we face. Let me stop my story there, and I hope I've not taken more time than I was allocated. I'm so very sorry. I think I've talked a lot. Thank you.
No, Simon, that was perfectly on time and deeply appreciated. I think some really important lessons that you've shared. So thank you very much. I'm sorry we didn't get to see you, but it is very appreciated. I'm now going to hand over to Ashish Kothari, who will present a little bit of a perspective and experiences from India.
So yeah, I'll add to the stories that we've just heard from different parts of the world, with some from India. As all of you who are on this call would know from the news that's traveling all over the world about the horrible situation we're in right now in India, where there's been a what can I say, a sort of a criminal failure of any kind of governance from the government to try and deal on how to deal with the second wave of the COVID pandemic, and also a total failure of the public health system. Now, in the midst of that, what I want to show is some counter narratives, some stories of where, like the ones that Vasna and Simon shared, communities were able to deal with the crisis in their own ways. Next slide. And then based on that, some lessons that we could learn from what kind of a recovery we can make from that. Vasna, you'll just have to keep clicking because I think these are so these stories are also partly based on a documentation that we've been doing over the last many years of community radical alternatives that communities are practicing on the ground for basic needs, for meeting aspirations, for issues like governance, gender justice, class justice, equality, water, health, education, etc., etc. We have about 2,000 stories of these from different parts of India on a website, which I will share at the end. Next slide, Vasna. Yeah, keep clicking and then you'll get to the next one. And so the first story I'm going to tell is a very inspiring one for me and for a lot of us, which is because this is from 5,000 women who belong to the most oppressed section of India's society, which is the so-called Dalits or the outcasts. And also as women, they are marginalized in a patriarchal society. Now, these women, having faced extreme levels of hunger, malnutrition, lack of access to food and to health and education and so on, till about 30 years back, they mobilized themselves into village level women's committees and then a larger federation over about 75, 80 villages, brought back all the traditional varieties of crops and turned completely to organic farming. They totally rejected the so-called green revolution, chemical-based farming that the government was proposing. They also fought for land rights for women, which is very unusual in India. They collectivized a lot of their operations, sharing seeds, etc., and moved over the next couple of decades to what they call food sovereignty, which means complete control over everything to do with food. And from that situation they were facing 30 years back, they are now in a situation of such security with regard to food and other determinants of health that, Vasna, next slide, that in the COVID period, they were actually able to provide food to those who did not have enough in their own villages. No, yeah, and also to the relief measures that were being taken by the district administration and the government, including the frontline workers that are working in extremely hard conditions to be able to provide them nutritious food. The next story is from, next slide, Vasna. The next story is from Central India. This is in the heartland of indigenous India. Indigenous people in India, at least those who are recognized officially as indigenous, are about 7 to 8%. And the maximum concentration is in Central India and Northeast India. Now, here in Central India, 90 villages of indigenous people have, for the last decade or so, formed a federation to do what they call self-governance, which is their slogan is that while we elect the government in New Delhi and Mumbai, in our village we are the government. We will be the ones who take the decisions with regard to everything to do with our lives. So they've taken complete control over the forests, which is their main source of livelihood, and the agricultural land. And through that, they have been earning revenues which are being put into village funds. And during the pandemic, again, when workers, migrant workers who had gone out of the villages and had to come back because they no longer had jobs in the cities, they were taken care of by the village through these village funds, providing relief and other packages that these people needed. And increasingly, they're moving towards a much more egalitarian and sustainable society. Next slide, Vasna. The third example is from Western India. This is a multi-caste, multi-religious village, a cluster of villages called Kunaria. And here, as soon as they heard of COVID in March last year, actually in February last year, they already put into place their community measures of safety, screening who's coming, going out, coming in, etc., maintaining physical distance, making sure everybody has masks and everything else that was necessary, but also insisting that all economic activity will continue. Unlike the rest of India, because when last year the government announced a complete lockdown, tens of millions of people did not have any jobs whatsoever. Whereas here and in other communities like this, they insisted that economic activity, work on the fields, work on village commons, etc., would continue so that people had access to livelihoods and to food and so on. And now they're in fact considering how do we move towards much greater self-reliance in making sure that we have all the household things that we need rather than buying them from the market. Can we actually produce within a cluster of villages? Can we produce the soaps that we need and the footwear and the clothes and everything so that we are not faced with these kind of crises in future? Next slide. So we have been documenting many of these stories. There are now 5 volumes of these stories with about 60 examples from different parts of India. Stories of women farmers, stories of youth, young people taking action, stories from the Himalaya, and many others like that. I will put in the chat box the link where you can download and see these stories. Now, next slide. So the sort of key lessons learning that we've learned from these, which in a way reflect also or complement what Vasna and Simon have been saying. The first one, most important, the sustaining or the revival of community spirit. Many parts of India, communities have actually lost that sense of communal working because of government interference or because of corporatization and commercialization. But it's where they've been able to revive that or sustain it that you find much better resilience. And in that, of course, also to challenge internal inequalities and marginalization within the community. The second very important part of this is where they have been able to regain collective rights to to their productive resources, the ecosystems, the tools, the machinery, the knowledge, anything to do with the means of production has to be in the hands of those local communities rather than in the hands of capitalist corporations or the government. The third important one is fighting for more direct decision making, more radical democracy, not waiting for governments to do things, not giving power over to governments and corporations, but saying power belongs to us, and we should be taking those decisions at the local level. The fourth one is localized self-reliance, like the examples I gave. As against economic globalization, how do we bring economic localization back, but along with, of course, all the struggles for social justice. And that includes much more localized exchanges, like between consumers and producers, rather than depending on long, large distance relationships, which are very vulnerable and prone to crises like the current one. And all of this also on the foundations of rebuilding our relationship with the rest of nature, realizing and thinking of ourselves as being part of nature and respecting other species, respecting the rights of not just human beings, but also the more than human or the non-human. Next slide. So building on all of this, this is a slide that Vasna has already shown, just to show the kind of holistic transformations that we need to work towards. It's not as if any of these initiatives is already perfect and is holistic, but we can see elements of this kind of transformation in a political, economic, social, cultural, and ecological sphere integrated with each other, moving towards these much greater levels of justice, sustainability, and equality. We've developed this sphere of transformation, or what we call the flower of transformation, much more in documentation, which I'd be happy to share later. Next slide, Vasna. In India, one of the models or approaches that we use is trying to sort of bring a whole lot of these movements and people and groups together in a process called the Vikalp Sangam, or the alternatives confluences, not conferences, to share, to collaborate, to build more of a critical mass, to also collectively dream the sort of India, the sort of vision that we want for an ideal society. So that's a collective process in which there are about 70 national level organizations and movements in India getting together. Next slide. And it's actually on the basis of this that the global tapestry of alternatives, this and other similar things happening in other parts of the world, that the GTA, which Vasna has already spoken about, is what we started a couple of years back. I think, Vasna, that's it. Next slide. Yeah, just some contact details and website for all of you to see. So very quick review of things that are happening in India. Contrary to the horrible and bad news that's doing the global rounds, and of course, it is pretty horrible in many parts of the country where people are suffering, people are dying, economic livelihoods have been lost. But there are counter trends, and we really need to listen to these counter trends and also put pressure on governments to make the policy shifts based on these sorts of lessons. Thanks, Vasna. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ashish. There is so much material in what is happening in India, and that's been captured, that it really requires a lot more time to delve into. So I appreciate you doing it in a short time.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon. Sorry. I just had a question for Ashish regarding what he experienced within communities. In terms of governments and government rules, and was there any resistance that communities faced, especially within that systems, like moving away from governmental systems and authorities? Was there any resistance that these communities faced and challenges that they faced?
Yeah, absolutely, Dylan. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. So yes, the thing is that in India, as in many other parts of the world, there is a token level of what they call political decentralization or economic decentralization. So we have, at least on paper, we have something like village self-governance and urban self-governance. But in reality, the state has never actually wanted to decentralize power. And so when communities do that de facto, and also using some laws that are progressive, but have almost never been implemented, such as, for instance, the Central Indian example I gave you, they used something called the Forest Rights Act to reclaim collective governance rights over forests, undoing 200 years of colonial and post-colonial history. Now, when communities do that, the state is obviously not happy. because it's in a sense it's losing its power. So they hit back. They do it in all sorts of different ways. First, they'll try bribing and breaking the village community and its internal cohesion and unity. If that doesn't work, they'll do harassment or threats. And this is often not necessarily done by the government. It can also be corporations or individuals who, in some way or the other, are connected. And then, if all of that does work, then actually imprisoning people, charging people with anti-national activities, sedition, so things like that. Some communities have unfortunately not been able to withstand that kind of attack by the state, but others, like the example I gave you, have been able to, because it's just the people power there is strong enough. And also building the national and global networking becomes very important, so that when a community faces such threats, there's immediately 1,000 other voices that will speak up and in support of them and express solidarity. This becomes very, very crucial.
Sure. Thank you for sharing the perspective, especially what communities go through. And it kind of just speaks to like the challenges that many communities face throughout the globe. I know I can even speak to some experiences that I had in Sri Lanka, where we were moving towards a more community-based like recycling process. And the government did not like that. And like we had a lot of resistance within Sri Lanka. So I can even just relate to like what communities go through at such a level when we're having such a major change. So thank you for sharing that perspective and giving light to that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's an important point that radical alternatives challenge the hegemony, and so they will not be easily accepted everywhere. So it will come with struggle as well. Is there anyone else who has any questions or experiences they would like to share?
Yeah, thank you, Vasna. I think just like Shiza said, the experience from the way I'm also working here in Africa, where we are working with earth jurisprudence. One of the ways is to try and revive those traditions and the governance that follow the law of nature. We say that nature is the primary text, and there is the way the nature is organized. And if we follow that law of nature, and we learn from nature, we cannot go wrong. So most of the work I'm doing with the communities here in Africa is trying to revive those nature-based governance system that is also informed by the way they live harmoniously with nature. So I think that is also very important. And now we are also documenting the customary laws of governance. And in Africa, we have also passed a resolution through African Union that also recognizes that the law that is generated from nature and from our African traditions and from our customary laws is one of the laws that can also help us to give us some solutions for the way we govern our natural environment. So this is also coming out as a key development, because also in Ethiopia, not in Ethiopia, sorry, in Uganda, the government has also passed a law that also recognizes the law of nature. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. I think that's a really important point, how so much of coloniality has dismantled the customary laws, but also how the narrative has been to then blame traditional communities for the damage to nature, and actually turning that around, inverting that story is really essential.
Thank you.
We've got just a few minutes left, and I realize we've thrown a lot of cases and materials at you. I hope that some of it finds resonance with the work that you are doing, with the communities that you are part of as well. And we also really wanted to take this opportunity of being invited to the conference to also reach out that if anybody is interested in also working closer with the GTA, helping us in weaving this tapestry together, please do get in touch. It is only something that we can all do together.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Vasna. And I think just like you have said on our behalf, I also want to appreciate our invitation to this conference. I think it's also a big learning for us. And it is through this that we can also learn a lot of what we can also share with our communities. But I think when we talk about stories of resilience, it's also important to recognize that the way we work with the communities needs to be very empowering, because when we begin to work, we realize that part of the knowledge we are trying to revive, we are trying to regenerate, is what our elders have been told that there's no space in the modern society. And it becomes like the alternative when the crisis come. In fact, the crisis we are dealing with, the crisis of the climate change, the crisis of the corona and the other pandemics that we are dealing with, and especially here in Africa also, we have done a study with the cyclone that affected Southern Africa. And we have seen also that the communities that followed the way we work by living in harmonious with our natural environment survive better when this crisis come. So the way sometimes the modern world works, we begin to look for solutions when problems come. But the way our ancestral wisdom works is that we deal with problems even before they arise. So I think mine is also to make a call that let's embrace the alternatives, and the GTA is a good avenue or a hub of where we can all come and share knowledge, share alternatives, because it is very clear that the modern structure is developing some cracks. We have already seen that. So I think what we need is these alternatives that we can use, we can actually offer, because where we are is like the world is looking for alternatives, and we are here to offer this alternative. From one community, from Africa, from India, it's very important also that the way we work with these communities, they feel that they are connected. It could be a very small community in India of 15 people, or even here in Africa, that is meeting passionately to remember and to go through the process of seeing what works for them, what is not working. That when they come together, they can bring a very powerful ideas, a hub of ideas that can save the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Simon has said something which is very wise. I totally agree with him. And I think to do that also, we need much more South-South solidarity. The global South has a lot to offer. It has a lot to offer to the global North, but also to each other. So learning across the cultures and geographies that we span becomes really, really important. And in that, I think people like us who have the privileges to be able to sit on the screen like this and talk to each other, we should be enabling communities on the ground to be able to speak to each other also. For instance, a few days from now, we're trying to see if we can get the Parque de la Papa Quechua indigenous people you spoke about, Vasna, and the Dalit women farmers here in India that I spoke about, to talk to each other, of course, on the screen. But if we can enable that kind of ground level grassroots communications, I think that will be very, very powerful. And the second thing, and this is something also through GTA we hope to do, is to have the resistance movements and the alternative movements also talking to each other. Sometimes they are the same, but sometimes they are not. Because resistance is very important to say no and to stop the bulldozer of statism, capitalism, patriarchy, and so on. But the yes is equally important, because when we defeat the system, what do we put in place of it is something that these alternative movements are showing us. So that combination also is really important of resistance and constructive alternatives. Thanks.
Thanks, Ashish. We're a minute over our time, so I think I will end it now and just say a very big thank you to everyone for your attention and joining us in the session, and just to wish you an enlightened rest of the conference. Thank you very much and have a good day.